Chapter 1. A small island with big dreams. Once upon a time, there was an island, cold, rainy, and surrounded by sea. It was called England. Not a superpower, not a world leader, just a small place with kings and fishermen, farmers, and dreamers. The year was 1500, and while other nations like Spain and Portugal were sailing the oceans, building empires, collecting gold and land, the English were still watching. But something stirred beneath those gray skies. A hunger, a fire, a question whispered in the hearts of merchants and monarchs alike. Why not us? Queen Elizabeth I answered that question. She wasn't just a queen, she was a symbol of ambition. Under her rule, English sailors turned into explorers and sometimes pirates. One man, Francis Drake, was called a thief by the Spanish and a hero by the British. He sailed around the world, raiding ships, collecting treasures, mapping routes. Every stolen coin, every battle won, added fuel to England's dream. But conquest does not begin with armies. It begins with trade. In the year 1600, a group of English merchants formed a company. It sounded harmless, just business. But it would go on to change the fate of millions. It was called the British East India Company. At first, they came with spices in mind: pepper from India, tea from China, silk from Asia. They built trade posts, they made deals, but they also brought cannons, they hired private armies, they built forts, not shops. And slowly they began to do more than trade, they began to rule. India at the time was a land of unimaginable wealth. Gold sparkled in its temples. Cotton clothed its people. Spices perfumed its markets. But India was not united. It was a mosaic of kingdoms and princely states, each with its own ruler, its own pride. And the British East India Company saw an opportunity. They smiled with one hand and stabbed with the other. They offered help to kings, then betrayed them. They created tension between neighbors. They whispered lies, paid bribes, and watched kingdoms fall from within. It wasn't just war. It was manipulation. And then came 1757, the Battle of Plassey. It was not a fair fight. The British, with their trained soldiers and secret deals, defeated the powerful Nawab of Bengal. That day, Britain didn't just win a battle, they stole a future. Bengal was one of the richest provinces in the world. After its fall, the British took more: Punjab, Delhi, South India. The company turned from traders into rulers, but trade has a dark side. To make money, they forced Indian farmers to grow cash crops: indigo, cotton, opium, instead of food. Fields that once fed families now filled British ships. The result? Famine, starvation, death. While British merchants became rich, millions of Indians perished in silence. And this was just the beginning. In just 150 years, England had gone from a small island to a rising empire, not because of kindness or cooperation, but because of ships, greed, strategy, and steel. And the world was watching. Because the lion had just opened its eyes, and soon it would bare its teeth. Chapter 2. The empire expands through blood and profit. The British Empire had tasted power, and it wanted more. What started as trade turned into control. What began with spices soon demanded land, gold, bodies, and silence. With the fall of Bengal, the British East India Company gained not just territory, it gained confidence, and with it a dangerous belief that the world could be ruled through profit and fear. India, a land of empires and poets, saints and warriors, soon became a chessboard. And the British were the players. They used a method that would define their rule: divide and rule. Promise one king protection, betray the other, arm one region, weaken another, turn neighbors into enemies, then step in like a savior. This was not war. This was strategy. By the early 1800s, large parts of India, Madras, Bombay, Delhi, Punjab, had fallen under British influence, not through open invasion, but through clever contracts, quiet bribes, and silent threats. But power is never satisfied. To feed Britain's growing factories, Indian farmers were forced to abandon food crops and grow indigo, cotton, and opium. But cash crops don't feed families. And so the harvest changed, and hunger was born. Fields once green with wheat were now blue with dye, and bellies were left empty. Famine swept across the land. Entire villages vanished. Children cried themselves to sleep. But British merchants celebrated profits. Gold sailed to London. Graves filled India. And India was not alone. Across the oceans, British ships anchored in Africa, the Caribbean, and North America, and with them came chains. The empire called it trade, but it was slavery. Men, women, and children, stolen from their homes in Africa, were packed into ships like cargo, shackled, beaten, starved. Many died before reaching land. The rest were sold. In the Caribbean, they worked in sugar fields from sunrise to death. In America, they were bred, branded, and buried with no name. In Africa, communities were torn apart. The British called it economy. History calls it evil. And as if that wasn't enough, Britain found another poison, opium. They forced Indian farmers to grow it, then forced China to accept it. When the Chinese resisted, Britain declared war, not for freedom, not for safety, but for the right to sell drugs. This was the opium trade, a dark alliance of greed and addiction. In every direction, the empire grew, and behind every deal, every law, every treaty, there was blood. The British built railways to move goods, not people. They opened schools to teach obedience, not freedom. They brought civilization, but left chains, silence, and scars. From Africa's gold mines to India's cotton fields, from Jamaica's sugarcane to China's broken ports, the empire marched forward, fueled by profit, protected by violence, and painted with the lie of progress. The world was changing, but the cost was millions of broken lives. The British Empire did not just conquer land, it conquered hope. Chapter 3. Resistance, Rebellion, and Ruthless Rule. The British Empire, now vast and wealthy, believed it could never fall. But power creates pressure, and pressure, one day, explodes. In North America, the first cracks began to show. 13 colonies, Boston, New York, Virginia, rich with resources, ruled from across an ocean. The British demanded taxes. The people demanded freedom. Why, they asked, must we obey a king we have never seen? The final spark came in 1773 when angry colonists threw crates of British tea into the sea. The Boston Tea Party. London responded with soldiers and stricter laws. But the time for silence had passed. In 1775, the American War of Independence began. For 8 long years, farmers with muskets faced Britain's mighty army, but these were not just rebels, they were dreamers. And in 1783, they won. The United States of America was born. The empire had suffered its first great loss. The world had seen something new. You can defy an empire and win. But while Britain lost America, it tightened its grip elsewhere. In India, the East India Company expanded its power, not just with soldiers, but with lies. One kingdom at a time was swallowed. Rulers were turned into puppets. Farmers were forced to grow opium and indigo, not rice. And when hunger came again, it came with death. The British had turned trade into tyranny, but India was watching. India was waiting. Then came 1857. Indian soldiers called sepoys served under the British flag. They were told to bite open new rifle cartridges, but these were greased with cow fat and pig fat. For Hindus, the cow is sacred. For Muslims, the pig is forbidden. This was not just disrespect, it was a deep wound. The sepoys rose. In Meerut, they rebelled, killing British officers. They marched to Delhi, shouting for justice, for freedom. It spread like fire. Peasants, workers, women, kings, people from every walk of life joined. It was more than a mutiny. It was India's first war of independence. For months, the British were terrified. For the first time, the empire shook, but empires strike back. And when Britain crushed the revolt, it crushed it brutally. Thousands were executed. Villages were burned. Innocent lives ended in silence. Still, the message had been delivered. India would not stay quiet forever. And so, a new chapter began. In 1858, shaken by the rebellion, Britain ended the rule of the East India Company. The British crown took control. Queen Victoria became Empress of India. The empire called it the Raj, a new beginning. But it was only a new mask on the same cruelty. India was no longer a business venture. It was now the jewel of a crown built on rebellion, resistance, and ruthless control. Chapter 4. The Illusion of Civilization. They said they came to civilize. They built railways, opened schools, and preached Christianity. They called it progress. But behind every train, every blackboard, every church was a hidden chain. This was the age of the British Raj in India and of the scramble for Africa. An era where Britain called itself a savior but acted like a thief. In India, after the 1857 rebellion, Britain ruled directly. No more East India Company. Now the empire wore a crown. They built courts, roads, railways, not for Indians, but for their own profit. Railways moved British soldiers. Laws protected British merchants. Schools taught English, not history, but obedience. Indians were not allowed in top jobs, not paid equally, not trusted to rule their own land. The British called it order. Indians called it what it was: humiliation. And at the same time, across Africa, Britain and other European powers rushed to claim land. They drew fake borders on maps, ignoring people, tribes, and history. They called Africa empty. They called it primitive. They called it the white man's burden to bring light to darkness. But the truth was darker. They took gold from South Africa, rubber from Congo, diamonds from Sierra Leone. They made Africans labor in mines, on plantations, in brutal heat, with barely any pay. And when they resisted, they were beaten, arrested, or killed. Even after slavery was officially banned, the cruelty continued. Africans were forced to carry passes. They were whipped for disobedience. They were stripped of identity and taught to admire the very people who oppressed them. In Australia, the British called it terra nullius, no one's land, but it was not empty. The Aboriginal people had lived there for over 50,000 years. The British sent prisoners to settle the land. They killed, displaced, and isolated native people. They called them savages. They erased their languages, their names, their children. In the Caribbean, slavery had left deep wounds. Even after abolition, black people were denied land, education, and power. They worked the fields while British families sipped sugar-sweet tea far away. The empire said it brought civilization. But whose civilization? It taught people to wear suits in 40 degrees Celsius heat, to speak English to be seen as smart, to forget their mother tongue to pass school, to see their skin, their gods, their names as lesser. This was not civilization. It was cultural colonization, a slow erasure of identity disguised as help. They erased and replaced and called it kindness. The illusion was powerful. The illusion was everywhere. But deep inside, people remembered. They remembered who they were before the empire came. And slowly, silently, they began to resist. Not just with swords, but with memory. Because no matter how many maps Britain drew, the soul of a people cannot be colonized forever. Chapter 5. War, Awakening, and the Cracks in the Empire. In the year 1914, the world caught fire. A single bullet in Europe, and the world was dragged into war. Britain joined the First World War with pride and power, but it was not alone. It called upon its empire. From the dusty villages of India, from the fields of Africa, from the islands of the Caribbean, millions answered. They were promised respect. They were told, "Fight for king and country, and your voices will be heard." So they marched. They fought in icy trenches, jungles, deserts, wearing thin uniforms, often barefoot, poorly fed. They bled for a crown that barely saw them. They died for a country they had never set foot in. When the war ended in 1918, the empire celebrated victory. But the soldiers returned to racism, poverty, disrespect. No medals, no gratitude, just silence. And from that silence, anger grew. In India, Britain passed the Rowlatt Act, a law to crush protests without trial. In Amritsar, on April 13th, 1919, thousands gathered. Men, women, children, unarmed, peaceful, hopeful. And then came the sound of bullets. General Dyer ordered fire. No warning, no mercy. Over 1,000 people were killed. Many were shot in the back while running toward the only exit, which was blocked. This was Jallianwala Bagh. This was a massacre. And from the blood-soaked garden rose a man in simple cloth with a powerful idea, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. He did not carry a gun. He carried a truth. "We will not obey," he said. "We will not fight you with violence. We will fight you with peace." He asked people to spin their own cotton, to march peacefully, to break unjust laws with courage. In 1930, Gandhi led the Salt March, 240 miles to the sea, to make salt from the ocean, defying British salt taxes. He was arrested again and again, but each time more people joined. He had no army, yet he shook the British Empire. And while Gandhi's voice echoed through India, Africa was awakening too. In Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, new leaders emerged, educated in British schools but disillusioned by British lies. They asked, "If we fight your wars, build your roads, grow your crops, why are we still treated like slaves?" Their questions had no answers. Then in 1939, the world plunged into war again. World War II. The enemy now, Nazi Germany. Once again, the empire turned to its colonies, and once again, they came. India gave 2.5 million soldiers. Africa gave thousands more. The Caribbean, Australia, Canada, all answered. But this time, the colonies were watching. They had seen Britain bleed. They had seen the empire's weakness. They had tasted the hypocrisy. You say you fight for freedom, but deny it to us. When the war ended in 1945, Britain was broken, exhausted, in debt, weak. And the people of the empire were done waiting. The Quit India movement had begun. Protests roared in the streets. Britain could no longer hold on. In 1947, the unthinkable happened. India was free, Pakistan was born, but the price was unbearable. Partition tore through hearts and homes. Over 1 million died. Millions more became refugees. The jewel of the empire was gone. And the cracks in the empire became impossible to hide. Across the globe, the silence had ended. From Africa to Asia, the Caribbean to the Pacific, the people were waking up. They remembered their names. They remembered their languages. They remembered their right to live free. And the empire, it could no longer hide behind railways and flags, because once people have seen the truth, they do not forget. They do not bow. Chapter 6, Freedom and the Ghosts, Left Behind. By 1947, the empire's strongest jewel, India, was gone. The Union Jack no longer flew over Delhi, but across the world, the British flag still waved. On buildings, courts, classrooms, and hearts, and slowly, one by one, that flag came down. Ghana, 1957. The first sub-Saharan African nation to break free. Nigeria, 1960. Kenya, 1963, after the brutal Mau Mau rebellion. Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, all walking toward independence. The Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, each chapter of empire slowly closing. But freedom did not mean peace. It did not mean healing, because when the British left, they didn't just pack their bags. They left behind wounds. Artificial borders, divided societies, stolen pride. The lines on maps were never drawn by local hands. In Africa, tribes were split. Somalis scattered across 4 nations. Tutsis and Hutus forced into false unity. In India and Pakistan, partition bled endlessly. Kashmir became a battleground of fear and fire, 3 wars and a nuclear shadow that still haunts today. In Palestine, promises made to both sides dissolved into conflict, a region now defined by loss, rage, and displacement. These were not accidents. They were the scars of exit without care. Power handed back with no support, no healing, no justice. And then there was language. English, left behind like a crown with no throne. It opened doors. To jobs, courts, schools, but only if you could speak it like the masters. If not, you were uneducated. You were laughed at. You were less. Local languages were punished in schools. Children were beaten for speaking their mother tongue. Languages like Yoruba, Swahili, Shona, Punjabi pushed into silence. English became both gift and weapon, uniting nations but dividing souls. Then came the invisible empire, the one that lived not on maps but in minds. Cultural colonization. British values still ruled after the empire was gone. In Nigeria, courts still followed British common law. In India, Shakespeare was still the standard of pride. In Kenya, Parliament still wore wigs like in Westminster. In the Caribbean, the Queen remained the head of state decades after independence. People wore suits in 40-degree heat, taught in English, dreamed in English, compared themselves to London, and always felt less. This was not freedom, this was a shadow. This was a mind still ruled, even when the chains had gone. And beneath it all, a truth too heavy for many to see. Racism didn't end with independence. It was baked into the empire's bones. It taught that white was civil and brown or black was savage. It taught that rulers were fair-skinned and ruled were not. In India, signs read, "Dogs and Indians not allowed." In South Africa, apartheid thrived under colonial systems. In Australia, Aboriginal people were counted as animals until 1967. Even after independence, racism remained in schools, media, jobs, self-worth. A Kenyan child shamed for her accent. An Indian man taught to bleach his skin. A Caribbean woman told she was too loud to be proper. An African student failing because her textbooks never told her story. These were the ghosts of empire, invisible but everywhere. And yet, people began to rise, they began to remember, they began to reclaim. In India, youth embraced their languages and films. In Kenya, Swahili became a language of pride and politics. In Nigeria, Afrobeat took the world by storm. In Barbados, the Queen was finally removed as head of state. The silence began to break. The truth began to breathe, because freedom was not just lowering a flag, it was raising your voice, it was loving your roots, it was healing from within. The British Empire was fading, but its shadow still touched everything. And only one thing could truly end it: truth. Not revenge, not shame, but truth. Spoken clearly, taught honestly, held tenderly in the hands of those who suffered. Chapter 7. The Invisible Empire and its Lasting Wounds. The flags had changed. The soldiers had gone. The palaces now held new leaders, and the streets echoed with the sound of freedom. But if you listened closely, you could still hear something else. The soft whisper of an empire that never truly left. Because while independence came on paper, in the heart, in the classroom, in the courtroom, the British Empire still breathed. This was not colonization by force. This was colonization of the mind. They called it civilization, but it was a subtle kind of rule. One that told you how to think, how to speak, how to dress, how to see yourself. In India, success was measured by your English. In Nigeria, courts still operated under British law. In Kenya, Parliament still echoed the architecture of London. In the Caribbean, the Queen's portrait still hung in government buildings, decades after her rule had ended. Even without soldiers, the empire remained. In the clothes people wore, in the accents they chased, in the shame they felt for their mother tongues. This was the invisible empire. You couldn't see it on a map, but it lived in every comparison to London, in every apology for native culture, in every child punished for speaking in Swahili, Yoruba, or Tamil. It was in the textbooks that never spoke of colonial crimes. In the classrooms that taught Shakespeare, but not local legends. In the courts that ruled in English, even when the people did not understand. And economically, the chains had not broken. They had only changed shape. Former colonies still exported raw materials: tea, oil, cocoa, rubber, while importing expensive finished goods from Britain and Europe. Loans came with interest. Aid came with strings. Trade agreements favored the old masters. And so a cycle formed, one that kept the rich richer and the free still dependent. They called it Commonwealth. But too often it was just common exploitation. Then there was the deeper scar, the one left on the soul: racism. The empire had taught that white skin was intelligence, that black skin was labor, that brown skin was subservience. Even after independence, that poison stayed. In media, where heroes were white and villains were not. In beauty standards, where fair was still considered lovely. In hiring practices, where accents and names were judged before merit. A Kenyan girl ashamed of her dark skin. A Caribbean boy told he was too loud, too wild, too unrefined. An Indian student taught that his culture was exotic but never excellent. These were not accidents. They were the echoes of an empire built on hierarchy. In homes, people still whispered stories they were once afraid to tell, of grandfathers who had been tortured, of grandmothers who had marched, of entire families broken by partition, of names changed to sound more British. These were the memories the empire tried to erase. But they remained, etched in silence, in fear and pride, passed down through generations. And now something is changing. Across former colonies, the children of the colonized are waking up. They are learning their languages. They are writing their stories. They are questioning their textbooks. They are wearing their skin with pride. In India, local cinema and literature rise stronger than ever. In Africa, Afrobeat, fashion, and storytelling reclaim identity. In the Caribbean, poetry retells the past in the voice of the oppressed. In London, students demand the truth be taught, fully, honestly, without shame. The invisible empire is being seen, and in being seen, it is beginning to fade. But this healing, it doesn't come from anger alone. It comes from truth, from acknowledging pain, not hiding it, from learning the full story, not just the one written by the conquerors, because if we forget the ghosts of empire, we risk repeating their steps. This isn't about blame. This is about memory, about healing, about rebuilding identity that was once torn apart and now must be put back together. The British Empire may have fallen, but its shadows remain. And until we shine a light on them, in every school, every family, every history book, they will continue to shape the present. So let us remember, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Let us teach not just the dates and flags, but the stories of the silenced, because only when the invisible becomes visible can we finally be free. Chapter 8. Reckoning, Resistance, and the Demand for Truth. The sun had long set on the British Empire. The Union Jack no longer flew over foreign lands. The Queen was no longer Empress. But the questions, the pain, the silence remained. And now the world was asking, will Britain finally face its past? From the crowded markets of Delhi to the quiet hills of Jamaica, from dusty archives in Nairobi to classrooms in London, a single truth was echoing louder than ever. History had been told from only one side. Where were the stories of the enslaved, of the stolen, of the children forced to forget their names and tongues? Where were the voices of the people crushed under the weight of empire? And more importantly, would anyone ever be held accountable? In Jamaica, leaders stood up in Parliament and demanded reparations. Not just money, but acknowledgement, an apology for slavery, for the lives stolen, the generations lost. In India, voices rose for the return of the Koh-i-Noor diamond, a gem taken not as a gift, but as a trophy. The British crown still wore it. India remembered how it was taken. In Kenya, survivors of the Mau Mau rebellion, elders with deep scars on their bodies and minds, took the British government to court. They spoke of beatings, torture, and humiliation inflicted in the name of control. In South Africa, historians revealed how British laws laid the foundation for apartheid. And in Barbados, the people made history, cutting ties with the British monarchy and declaring themselves a republic, free and proud. Afriks, the call was not for revenge, it was for truth, to return what was stolen, to teach what was hidden, to name what was denied. But how did Britain respond? With resistance, with silence, with polished words like, that was in the past. We brought railways and schools. We owe nothing. Museums still held looted treasures, the Benin bronzes, the Elgin marbles, Egyptian mummies, priceless objects taken by force, displayed behind glass with no context, no apology. In schools, the empire was still painted in gold, a tale of tea and trade, not chains and blood. Churchill was called a hero. The Bengal famine, barely a footnote. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre, a paragraph. But the silence was cracking. The people began to speak. Not politicians, not institutions, but artists, writers, educators, musicians, filmmakers, students. They wrote books like Legacy of Violence, Empire Land, The Anarchy, exposing how millions died in famines, how cultures were erased, how lies were used to justify power. They made documentaries that showed the faces of those who suffered and the voices that had been silenced for generations. Young people in Britain asked, why didn't we learn this in school? Why are we proud of an empire built on pain? Why do our textbooks lie? And around the world, a fire was lit. In Nigeria, Afrobeat singers wove colonial trauma into their songs. In India, Dalit writers exposed how British laws deepened caste divisions. In Trinidad, poets resurrected the ghosts of sugar plantations through verse. In Kenya, children learned Swahili with joy, not shame. And in London, statues of slave traders were brought down by hands that had had enough. This was not a rebellion of weapons. This was a revolution of memory, a fight not to change the past, but to tell it truthfully, because silence is not peace. It is a prison, and the only key is honesty. The world no longer asked for permission to remember. It demanded it. People were not asking for pity. They were asking for clarity, for truth in history books, for dignity in remembrance, for justice without delay. And still, in some places, the empire lingered. In immigration laws that favored white countries, in economic policies that kept former colonies dependent, in beauty standards where lighter skin was still praised, in classrooms where children still learned about kings, but not about the people they ruled. But the tide has turned. Now a new generation stands up, not just in the former colonies, but in Britain itself. They speak many languages. They carry many names. They are the children of empire, but they refuse to carry its silence. They organize, they educate, they question, they remember, because memory is power, and storytelling is resistance. They are not trying to rewrite history. They are trying to complete it. And this is not about shame. This is about truth. Because without truth, there can be no healing. Without honesty, no reconciliation. And without history, real history, there can be no justice. The British Empire has ended, but its reckoning has just begun. And the world is watching, not with hatred, but with hope that someday soon the nations who once ruled will finally listen to those they ruled over and say the words the world has waited to hear. We remember, We acknowledge. We are sorry. Until then, the voices will grow louder, the stories will spread farther, and the truth will no longer be hidden. Chapter 9. The End of Empire, the Start of Healing. The sun has long set on the British Empire. The Union Jack no longer flies over palaces in Delhi, Nairobi, Kingston, or Lagos. The British monarch is no longer emperor or empress of distant lands. But even as the empire vanished from maps, its shadows stayed behind in laws, languages, minds, and memories. Today, the world wears the scars of that empire. Some of them are visible, borders drawn in haste, economies still catching their breath, statues still standing tall over stolen lands. Others are invisible. Shame passed through generations, erased histories, accents used to judge intelligence, skin color used to deny opportunity. This is not a call for hate. This is a call for truth. To heal, we must name the wound. To move forward, we must understand the past, not the version written in the margins of school books, but the real story of what was taken, of what was silenced, of what still remains. In Britain, many people never learned what the empire truly did. They were taught glory, not greed, railways, not rebellions, civilizing missions, not massacres. But now a new generation is asking, why weren't we told the truth? In India, young minds are reclaiming forgotten heroes and speaking proudly in their own languages. In Kenya and Ghana, cultural festivals and local art are reviving what colonialism tried to erase. In the Caribbean, the music of pain has turned into the voice of pride. In universities and classrooms around the world, students are rewriting history, not out of vengeance, but out of justice. Because healing does not begin with silence, it begins with honesty. And honesty begins with listening, not just to the rulers and conquerors, but to the enslaved, the colonized, the resisted, the erased. We are all living in the world the empire helped build. If you speak English, if your country once had a British flag, if you live under systems that were once colonial, this is your story too. It belongs not just to the colonized, but to the world. And now, with eyes open and hearts aware, we must carry this story forward, not to pass on pain, but to prevent it from returning. Not to divide, but to unite in truth. Not to dwell in guilt, but to rise in responsibility. Because the end of empire is not the end of its story. It is the beginning of healing, of remembering with clarity, of teaching with truth, of building a world where no one's culture is called inferior, where no language is shamed, where no nation is ruled by silence. Let the empire fall, finally, fully. Let justice grow where conquest once stood. Let this be the age not of empire, but of empathy, equality, and understanding. And let the last line of this long, painful history be written not in war, but in wisdom.